one of our hosts, Prof. Cheng. So if you're able to, there's an icon against your name where you can just change or rename yourself to your actual name, because I'm seeing almost everybody in the meeting is coming by the name Prof. Cheng. So if you're able to, please just change your name or rename yourself so we're able to identify who is who. I think that's just one of the technical features we expect in these meetings when we send or we have one link that has gone through. Again, we'll be watching out on the list to see who has their hand raised at any point of the meeting. So once you click on the list of participants, and just below there, you'll see, as on this diagram, you'll see an icon that is allowing you to raise your hand. Then we'll see that. And once you finish speaking, you can lower your hand accordingly. Then just to inform you that we are recording this session, and we will also be streaming it live on Facebook, where we could also have that recording stored for future use. So I think we could just start and just have another look at the program, how the sessions are and what we expect to have. So for the first 10 minutes, we're just introducing or setting the scene of the discussions. Then after that, we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll have a session panel discussions of the panel proceedings. And then we'll go into 2 sessions of Q&A. The first question and answer session will be just right after the panel. Then before the second Q&A, we'll have reflections from our regional focal points, that is the ARIN regional focal point. And then after the second Q&A, we'll now proceed to wrap up the session. So that's how the 2 hours of the seminar are going to be structured. So just moving forward, we have a set of panelists that have been invited for this meeting. As I mentioned, Kennedy, my colleague Kennedy and myself will be moderating, facilitating the 2-hour session. And then we'll have a panelist, Dr. Sandra Chan, from the German Development Institute, and then we'll have Dr. Peter Powell from the German Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. And then we'll have Professor Dr. Manish Shrivastava from the TERI, I think in India, in New Delhi, India. And then we'll have, finally we'll have Ms. Nachi Major from ICLI Africa, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. And then after the panelists speak, we'll have Professor Ed Brown, the Modern Energy Cooking Services Program Director, based at Loughborough University, to summarize or synthesize the discussion, the panel discussion. So that's how we're going to have that. And then, as I mentioned again, we'll have the focal points. We have 5 focal points. We'll be also giving the remarks as the meeting proceeds. So at this point, let me now usher in my colleague Kennedy to just tell us more about what ARIN is, and then just set a scene for the background of the seminar. And yeah, then from that, we'll move to the panel session. So Kennedy, most welcome.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for a very nice overview, and a warm welcome to everyone to this seminar today. A big thank you to our panelists as well as the discussants. So I think I'll give you a brief overview of what ARIN is all about and how this seminar series sits within a broader context of other activities. And then from there now we can get into the interesting part of the seminar today, which is the panel discussion. So what is ARIN, or the African Research and Impact Network? So ARIN, the African Research and Impact Network, is a platform for researchers to leverage on their work to bring out a unified voice of Africa's research priorities. Because when we set up ARIN initially, we were trying to respond to a gap where there are very many talented African researchers, but they didn't have a platform whereby they could engage with each other, but also with other researchers across the world. So I think by having a conversation or a seminar like today, we are able to have conversations, engaging African researchers, but also other researchers across the world on topics that are of mutual interest. Second, ARIN aims at fostering connection and peer learning among its researchers. So as I mentioned, very many talented researchers, but they could not, they didn't have many platforms to speak with each other. And I think through ARIN, we're able to make those kinds of connections. So I hope also the participants that are here can also get to connect with other participants. We've seen already in the chat box, people are already giving their details. So keep the connections going. That's why we have this platform. ARIN also seeks to connect a network of scholars across and beyond Africa in various fields to leverage their knowledge towards Africa's research excellence and pathways. And this means that ARIN is not only focused on the African continent, but uses the African continent as a base on which to engage on topics within and outside the continent. And I think, for example, if you look at today's panel, you can see the researchers from Africa, but also from outside Africa, and we can all sort of engage in topics that cut across, for example, today's topics of climate action and COVID-19. So these are the kinds of connections that we're trying to establish with the ARIN network. So what are the thematic focus for ARIN? So we have two kinds of focuses. One is the thematic disciplines, where we look at sustainable development, climate and energy, cities and resilience, agriculture and forestry, mining, trade, industry, technology, and innovation. So these are the themes on the one side, but they also intersect with analytical approaches. We're very much interested in research and forecasting and picking topics, for example, that are very much of interest now and in the near future. For example, the intersection between COVID-19 and climate action. We also do policy analysis, convening and influence. We try to conduct our research in a way that it seeks to answer some of the pressing policy questions in the continent, but also globally. We're also keen on capacity building and support. And I think to give an example of a program that we currently launched, which is the ARIN Fellows, the premier fellowship that allows young African researchers to connect with each other and also identify opportunities to build their capacity. We also have knowledge systems, business finance models, and partnerships and strategies. So in a broad sense, you can see there's a very strong connection between research and policy, but also trying to ask and tackle some of the really big questions that affect the continent, but also the globe. So where does this seminar series sit? So today's seminar is part of a preparatory series. I think it's the third. We had two other series before. One was on science, technology, and innovation. And I think we had another one on cities and COVID-19. So today we'll be looking at the nexus between climate action and COVID-19. So this we had planned a couple of series to lead up to a big event, which is later in the month. We'll tell you a little bit more about it shortly, which is the ARIN conference. So this series, these three series that we convened over the last 3 months, helping us to really tease out some of the key topics that we'll be tackling at the conference. So as I've mentioned, we'll have an annual conference, the ARIN annual conference, whose details we'll share after this. It will be on 18th to 20th November 2020. And part of that, we have a book project that we're putting together. And during the conference, we'll be presenting, for example, some of the chapters which are drawn from very cutting-edge research on COVID-19 and what it means for Africa's resilience. So far we have quite a number of good draft chapters. So if you get to attend the conference, you'll get to engage with some of that cutting-edge research. So that's where this seminar fits in the broad picture. But also there's a technical background. So number one, of course, as we said, we pick the very timely topics and we try to engage with them. So everyone is aware that economies everywhere have collapsed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But as now countries try to put in a lot of money to rescue these economies, there's a big connection between tying such kind of funding to climate change. So that's the thematic topic of our discussion today. But we also are trying to connect that with some of the long-running issues. For example, how does this topic play out in the different contexts? Especially giving due attention to the poor and the most vulnerable. And I think that's something that we'll really tackle here today. We also hope to get some deeper reflection on the COVID-19 and the climate nexus in today's discussion. So part of critical reflection has been a running thread in our seminar series. So for today, specifically, we'll be looking at number one, the connection between clean energy and economic recovery in the post-COVID world, and seeing whether countries will really shift their investments in rescuing economies to support climate change, whether mitigation through clean energy or strengthening the resilience of countries. So I think finally, this work or this seminar sits on top of some prior work that had been done before. And I think with Sandra Chan, who will be one of the panelists, and others we've worked, and Manish, we've worked on a project that sought to look at the non-state actors in in climate governance in Africa, in the global south, India, and Kenya. But we also drew some of those insights to some of the work on COVID-19. For example, we looked at how some of those, we call them last mile initiatives, especially in the African context, where you have these networks that are loose that try to provide solutions which governments and others do not. And then we also have, sort of some analysis on the role of subnational networks in looking at people-centered COVID-19 responses. So this seminar sits on top of a lot of analytical work that has been going on. So I think at this point, I'll hand over to Vicky to now introduce us to the panel discussion, where now we'll get to tease out in a little bit more detail some of the things that we've introduced and presented. So over to you, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Kennedy, for that very good overview of ARIN and the seminar as well, and for setting the scene for this discussion, which is now going right straight to the panel discussion. And as earlier mentioned, we have a very great and interesting set of panelists who are going to take us through some of the insights on our topic today: low carbon development and climate resilience beyond COVID-19. So we have 4 panelists, and each one of them is going to have 10 minutes to speak to a question that we're going to pose to them. And without wasting too much time, we'll just go straight to introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Sandra Chan. Dr. Sandra Chan, as Kennedy has mentioned, we work together on the Climate South project, which is almost ending now, but very interesting perspectives have come out of there in terms of climate action. So Dr. Sandra Chan is a political scientist who is specialized on international environmental governance, and he is based at the Global Center on Adaptation and also the German Development Institute in Germany. The Global Center on Adaptation is based in Netherlands. So he's also an assistant professor at the Institute of Sustainable Development in Utrecht University. So Dr. Sandra, we are going to pose this question to you, which goes looking at when we see now at how countries across the world are now injecting so much money to revive their economies now after being hit by the COVID-19. How can these countries use that opportunity to support climate action and low carbon development? So Dr. Sandra, you have 10 minutes to speak to this question. And so,
yeah, thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
So I actually prepared a small kind of slideshow, but I think we can do without, and I will just speak to your question as best as I can. So one thing that I've been doing over the last couple of months, actually very much in the beginning of the pandemic, is to kind of bring a group of researchers together and experts to think about like what economic downturn does to climate action. And I think the question on how it impacts countries is is an important question. I would like to say a bit more though about the impact on non-state climate action though, and also subnational action, because if you look at the very beginning of the pandemic, you actually saw some almost like optimistic or positive messaging in the media about the effect of COVID-19 on in terms of environmental impact. So those satellite photos that show how emissions have gone down and pollution has gone down, that carbon dioxide emissions have gone down. But it's important to note, of course, that if there's no investment or move towards structural changes, we will probably see a very strong rebound in emissions and also in terms of economic growth, which is already the case in China, where the smog days have returned. At the same time, we have to think about what type of crisis this is, because if we look historically over the 20th and the 21st century and compare different crises, not every crisis has had the same impact economically and environmentally. So you might see that, for instance, the oil crisis in the 1970s or the collapse of the Soviet Union, these are crises, political and economical crises that had some impact on the trajectory on, for instance, emissions. However, for instance, the global financial crisis was really a missed opportunity to change course. Then if you look at, so I think the point is that not every crisis is the same, and we have to kind of judge every crisis by its own merit. And particularly with this crisis, it seems like maybe the impossible becomes possible. We have seen that one difference with this crisis is that we genuinely see a new global public. Other than 20 years ago or even 15 years ago, everyone is connected by smartphones and through relatively good, not everyone, but most people are relatively well connected. So you have a global audience, and I think that might also mean that we experience the crisis as a global crisis more than previously. We see that this crisis has exposed kind of the weaknesses of the global economy. We see mass unemployment, and an important aspect of this crisis is this is not a normal economic crisis. This crisis has exogenous origins. It is literally a matter of life and death. And such a type of crisis could make the impossible possible. It could mean that we truly transform our economies, that we truly go on a path of green recovery. And economic stimulus packages can be important in that, in the sense that the moment that we, as is the case now, deploy enormous stimulus packages. This is a chance, an opportunity, but we need to ask whether this deployment creates new carbon lock-ins, whether it really helps a green recovery. I think this is especially important to ask, given the fact that the previous financial crisis has actually led to new carbon lock-ins instead of getting us on the green recovery pathway. So I think you can speak of a good stimulus or a bad stimulus, or I would say the regular stimulus, as we have seen in the financial crisis, is a bad stimulus in our times. A regular stimulus, as we have seen in terms of the bailout of fossil fuel industries, saving airlines, is incredibly counterproductive from a climate point of view. And a good stimulus in this respect might mean a managed industrialized destabilization of industries that are on the longer term bad for a green recovery. And we do have historical examples there. For instance, the coal industry in the Netherlands and in the UK has been dismantled in a managed fashion. And this is also a strategy that could be considered in a green stimulus and in rescue packages. However, I do think, like, you know, we are looking at another missed opportunity maybe already. A lot of the stimulus and a lot of the budgetary kind of rescue that we have seen is really kind of the support of general budgets, for instance, and some of it has been directed to save not so clean companies. So we are at risk at losing this opportunity. If I talk about climate action, it's not only about government. So we have seen an enormous kind of groundswell of non-state and subnational climate action. And in fact, if you look at the mitigation potential, but also potential in terms of building resilience, it might be even greater at the subnational level and among non-state actors. And I think the impact here might be very substantial in the sense that a lot of this action is voluntary, and this might lead to a lower prioritization of climate actions. So this is very important to kind of monitor. This is something that we are currently doing. Actually, we have a climate action tracker where we look at non-state and subnational climate action. And we hope to be able to present with results on the performance of climate action over 2020 in January, so that we can see whether there's something of a COVID dip in terms of performance of non-state actions. So we hope to be able to report on that better. What we are also currently doing is not only to see whether this has affected the performance of kind of non-state and subnational climate action, but also to look at how these actions are affected. So at the moment we have a survey out where we try to understand, for instance, which aspects of climate action, what activities have been affected, whether positively or negatively. So if we look at currently, if we look at non-state action on the basis of preliminary data, we see, for instance, that there's some negative impacts on on-the-ground implementation because maybe of lockdown. So that has caused delays in some activities, but we also see some positive effects. So for instance, in knowledge dissemination, you see a move towards bigger audiences online. Surprisingly, we still don't see an effect on funding, but that might be because a lot of the funding of non-state climate action might be kind of determined over multiple years. So this might be a delayed effect. Anyway, I leave it at this. I think, I look forward to your questions here.
Very well, Sander, for that very great, analysis of opening up this discussion, giving us ideas of the kind of crisis that we're looking at, prompting us to really look what kind of crisis is the COVID-19, how do we look at it in terms of the kind of impacts that it's brought, and very great insights how you indicated how COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses, our global economy. And also, very importantly, looking at the economic stimulus packages, which probably we could look at that and what kinds can the African governments aim at, focusing on moving forward. But we'll come back to that, and hoping that we'll get some more questions to expand that conversation. Just to remind us, you're able to change your name. I think there was a hitch on just sending the invitation, the link that participants are joining in. So just against your name, you can just click on the icon and rename yourself from Ciprosocheng, which is now becoming the very common name in this name, but not to worry about that very much. And just remind us, if you have any questions, please just type them on the chat and we'll be able to just come back to that later. So now moving to the next speaker, I'll now introduce Ms. Nachi Majo, who's based at ICLEI Africa in Johannesburg, South Africa. So introducing Nachi, who's a senior professional officer on climate change, energy, and resilience at ICLEI. Who is very well experienced in working in the local government in terms of sustainability. And she's a sustainable development practitioner who's worked a lot on both national and subnational governments across Africa for very long. And then her experience includes development of policies, action plans, and implementation of various projects that are looking at the climate action planning and energy access. Very extensive background on you, Nachi. So for you, based on your experience, we want to just pose this question to you from that experience working with subnational and national governments. In what ways do you see COVID-19 affecting or influencing local economic development, climate action planning, and energy access? So Nachi, please, if you may.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and good day, everyone. It's good to be part of this very interesting session. So I think just as a way to start, we are all aware that the daily life of every person has in some way changed as a result of the COVID pandemic. And the same applies to, well, for subnational officials in particular, with some of the officials being deployed to support response operations, therefore being taken away from their normal service delivery responsibilities. And those that are able to continue working with pre-COVID deliverables are doing so with limited access to offices or working from home, as is the case with most of us today. And this has come with some limitations, such as restricted or complete absence of face-to-face meetings and engagements with communities in particular, as well as budget shifts that have now moved towards COVID responses. So building resilience in African cities is more critical than ever before as we move forward during the COVID pandemic, but also after. So these challenging and uncertain times are forcing us to discover and implement new and innovative ways of working, as good practices are starting to emerge and signifying what we're calling the new normal. So at the onset of the pandemic, as part of our support package to cities, as ICLEI Africa, we introduced an initiative called Building Sustainable African Cities during and after a pandemic, which over the past few months has created a platform for city leaders, political and technical, to be able to share experiences, learn from each other, share knowledge and good practice, and to also inspire new ways of building resilience at the local level, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. So the objective of the Building Sustainable Cities during and after a pandemic initiative are really to provide guidance to local governments across Africa on how to respond to the pandemic. And also at the center of it is to help them to address climate change, health, waste management, energy, and other sectors that are relevant to African cities. And through this initiative, local governments and subnational governments have shared, and they continue to share their experiences, as well as best practice as well, and advice on how to prepare for how to prepare for and build resilience before, during, and post-crisis, such as the one that we're currently experiencing at the moment. So from the lessons that have been shared by the subnational governments in particular, there has not necessarily been a homogeneous approach or response to the pandemic. Some national and subnational governments, for example, have used control measures to control the spread of the disease, and others have implemented lockdowns which has been very popular in a lot of cities such as Kinshasa in the DRC, in Nairobi, across South Africa's cities, and certainly other cities have done the same. And many others have opted for curfews and setting of rules for social distancing, emphasizing hygiene and the likes. So that's been the status quo, so to say, which of course has shifted with time and as we begin to find different ways of responding to COVID-19. So I'll be sharing how COVID-19 is affecting or influencing local economic development, climate action planning, and energy access in cities in particular. So in terms of local economic development, African cities' economic contribution in relation to growth, jobs and revenues is far higher than their share of the national population. And as a result of this, the economic shocks due to COVID-19 has had a significant impact on cities. Nairobi's trade sectors, for example, are expected to contract by 5%, and the economy of Durban in South Africa is expected to decline by 4 to 6%. And this contraction in the urban economy of other cities as well, so not just the examples that I've mentioned, will result in reduced municipal revenues, such as from property rates and taxes, which before COVID were already constrained. And a number of cities also shared with us that during COVID, there's been a significant reduction in revenue collections as people have not been able to pay for their services as a result of job losses as well as salary cuts. And other cities have also resorted to reducing or eliminating rates and taxes as part of their social relief efforts. And the impact of this is obviously fewer or limited financial resources available to deliver services such as water and sanitation, electricity, healthcare, waste management, and more broadly, much needed infrastructure. So African cities are experiencing negative economic impacts due to the lockdown and movement restriction measures, and the result of which is the economic contraction in local economies, as I mentioned. And this is affecting both the formal and the informal sectors. So the International Labour Organization estimated that COVID-19 will lead to a loss of up to 25 million jobs. And it is said that in reality, this is actually going to be much, much higher. And we all know that the informal sector is very important in Africa, currently estimated to be providing 71% of employment to the population. And this sector is particularly hardest hit. So we can just imagine what is going to happen to people's livelihoods. And with people just going deeper and deeper into poverty. So I'll now talk a bit more about how COVID-19 has impacted climate action planning and energy access. And just to say that COVID-19 happened in the year 2020, the year of the official commencement of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So the timing could not have been any worse, given that the world is already struggling to enhance climate actions, and we're not on track to meet climate targets. So it really is a devastating pandemic to have happened to us. And it goes without saying that Africa is more vulnerable than other regions due to the natural traits, such as our climate, but also due to man-made inequalities and the high level of poverty. So the combination of this then results in low adaptive capacities, high sensitivities to climate shocks and other issues. So I think we've all heard about the parallels drawn between COVID-19 and the climate emergency in Africa, so I won't get into the details about that. However, I'd like to mention that over many years, climate change advocates have been pleading for the world to be cognizant of how climate change is becoming a threat to people and the economy. And COVID-19 has affected the process and plans with regards to climate action planning. And as an example, Italy Africa, together with our partners, GIZ, ARIN Acts, are working on a program called Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa, where we're working with counties and cities. In Kenya, we're working with Nakuru, and in Burkina Faso, Garua, and then in Cameroon, we're working with Bobo Gilaso. And we're working with them to help them develop sustainable energy access and climate action plans, so CICAPs, which require a substantial amount of primary data collection and stakeholder engagements in order to help with the development risk and vulnerability assessments, greenhouse gas emissions inventories, and energy access assessments. And this work has been affected quite a lot because we're not able to execute it as a result of COVID restrictions. So the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on climate change and energy access are very complex. They're deep-rooted, they're diverse, and given that cities and national governments are already grappling with so many other challenges, it just, in a way, puts salt to a wound, so to say. And as mentioned, COVID-19 is affecting trade, revenue, the agricultural sector, and so many other sectors. And at the same time, climate-related shocks such as droughts and floods are constraining efforts to early recovery from the COVID-19 situation. So in conclusion, I would just say that due to the crisis, many countries are said to will go into a recession, and this was also alluded to, which then means that there will be significant budget shifts and cuts away from the implementation of climate action and the provision of energy access as a priority, because then priorities will be more around relief, provision of water, and human settlements and other aspects. So lastly, I would just say that although there have been great efforts from cities to respond to the crisis, there's a need for more decentralized responses to COVID. And this requires strengthening local government capacity to be able to respond to the crisis, while at the same time balancing the provision of climate responsive services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nachi, for that very wonderful outline or analysis of the African context. I think you've very well outlined some of the vulnerabilities that African continents are facing, outlining how the restrictions from the COVID-19 are coming along the way of implementation of climate action or reaching the local communities. But very importantly, you've mentioned the aspect of platforms that African nations can look at, moving forward in towards the economic recovery that we're looking at. We'll come back to that because that's one of the things that IRIN is aiming to achieve. And then again, you've highlighted the very interesting or very, very pertinent issue of financial constraints that COVID-19 is showing or bringing up in terms of how African governments are being affected. And then you've very well broken down the issue of budget shifts. So we'd like to now look at some of these financial mechanisms and now hear or move to the next presenter, Dr. Peter Powell, who's very well conversant in some of this green financial mechanisms. But before I introduce Peter, just remind us that we can keep the conversation going on the chat section. We'll very much like to hear some of these contexts that are being spoken into, and just we can have a discussion going on there, and we'll be happy to come back to that. So just now to introduce the third speaker, Dr. Peter Powell, who is a senior researcher at the Frankfurt School of Finance Management. Will give us who is very well conversant with policy advice on climate policy and climate finance. He's published widely book chapters, scientific papers, and reports, and very, very, very important to note the IPCC. He's been an author in that and leading a chapter on the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. Very, very, very key to some of the issues we're looking at. So Dr. Peter, I would like to ask you this question. As the green finance is becoming more important in the transition to low carbon climate resilient economies, there is a need to strengthen the technical capacity to mobilize these resources. So just to reflect on the NDC Finance Fellowship, which is ARIN is also part of, and other similar programs that you're involved in, how can this capacity be strengthened and scaled? Dr. Peter, if welcome to give your input.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for this kind introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's my pleasure. I'm not switching on my camera because I'm actually laying in bed with a bad pain in my back. So I'll keep you from that. But I'm happy to do my talk anyway, and so I didn't want to.
Sorry about that, Peter. Sorry.
It's okay. I think it will be fine. It's just that I can't sit behind my computer at the moment, but I did really want to do this, so that's why I'm doing from bed. Yes, so thanks for this question. I'll try to answer it as good as I can, and in doing so, I'd like to make a difference or a distinction between the pre-corona phase, where we are now, corona, and a potential post-corona. And I'd like to start by saying that even before the corona crisis, the financial landscape to address climate change was already changing. You know, in the past, ODA and also climate finance were quite important for countries to address climate change through adaptation and mitigation. And these are both still increasing in absolute terms, but I think they're losing relevance. And I think Sander Chan also indicated that they're losing relevance in relative terms. So this kind of international traditional public support was stable, is still stable, it seems, and focuses on adaptation and mitigation, but they represent an increasingly smaller share of the total financial flows going to countries and being invested in countries, for example, compared to remittances, to FDI, to private debt, etc. And then in addition to this, it was clear actually for a while already that the international public support, so the ODA and the climate finance coming from developed countries, was insufficient anyway to prevent dangerous climate change, and it was insufficient anyway to adapt to climate change. So just as an example, in a paper we published in the Journal of Climate Policy, we demonstrated that most developing countries make their nationally determined contributions. So these are climate action plans under the UN climate negotiations. But most developing countries make these conditional to international support. But if we look at all the related costs of these conditions, then these can never be covered through climate finance under the UNFCCC, under the UN climate negotiations. So even in the unlikely case that developed countries will manage to mobilize what they have pledged, that's 100 billion per year from 2020 onwards, and even if all this money would be spent to help developing countries to implement their climate plans, it would still be far from sufficient. So there's a huge finance gap, and international public support is not able to fill that. But what we are doing now in the finance chapter of the upcoming adaptation gap report, which is published by UNEP probably in February, we include this concept of sustainable finance and the Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. So sustainable finance is a relatively new concept, and it's much broader than green finance, which is mentioned in the title of this question. So green finance is basically about, what kind of investments are green in terms of, reducing emissions or supporting adaptation or reducing the loss of biodiversity. But sustainable finance is not just about doing more green, it's also about doing less brown. So how do you disincentivize investments in coal, in oil, in gas? And the Paris Agreement is also addressing this issue when it says in its Article 2.1c that it's about making finance flows consistent with low carbon and climate resilient development. So this is both about the more green finance and less brown finance. And if you're looking purely from a how do you save the climate perspective, then sustainable finance is much more significant than the traditional climate finance or the support from developed countries to developing countries. I'm not saying that that it's less important or more important for developing countries, because I mean this public support from developed countries is crucial, in particular also to make sure that the most vulnerable people are supported. But if you look at purely from a climate perspective, how do you prevent dangerous climate change, then sustainable finance is much more important. So the point here is, and then I end this part of the presentation, is that even before Corona, we saw the financial landscape broadening from this focus on, let's say, international public support in terms of grants usually, towards more innovative systems such as loans and equity, as well as green bonds that Kenya, for example, issued, and also in terms of actors. So no longer just public actors that said we have to invest in mitigation adaptation, but an increasingly broadening field of private actors and private financial actors as well. And then came COVID-19, and I think we're still trying to understand what it's all about. But it's clear that there has been a massive healthcare crisis in developed countries and developing countries all over the world. And I think there's three observations or two observations I'd like to make that kind of indicate that the current COVID crisis, might help us to move economies and to move societies towards more sustainable direction. So first of all, it's very interesting to see that there has been 30 years of climate change negotiations. Developed countries and developing countries alike have been trying to put climate policies on the table, have been trying to put restrictions on the table, but never ever were they allowed, was it really allowed to go at the cost of the economy? There were always actors standing up saying like, climate action okay, but not at the cost of our economies. But all of a sudden, the healthcare crisis caused by COVID-19 is able to do this. So basically, Corona made a lot of things fluid again that we thought were fixed and unchangeable, that we thought were, that we took for granted or for given in our economies. So just the fact that governments are locking down countries, the IMF has even coined this the big lockdown. Who would have thought that would be possible? The fact that governments are setting up huge public stimulus packages, taking on massive debts to keep their economies going. The fact that industries such as oil and aviation could never be touched by climate policy. Aviation and shipping was even excluded from the international climate negotiations, but it's now hit very hard by regulation that responds to COVID-19. And then I think also important, there was a general trend since the 1990s in particular about moving towards reducing trade barriers and supporting international trade and economic efficiency. But now all of a sudden countries openly start to indicate that they prefer it if certain products are made at home rather than imported for less money from abroad. So we see all these interesting changes, and I think the longer the crisis lasts, the bigger the opportunity to make long-term changes to our economic models. And then as a second observation, I think within countries, it's very clear that the poorest and most vulnerable are generally the hardest hit by Corona. You see that in every country, but of course it's worse in some countries than in others. In particularly in countries where people are not having formal contracts, or where they're not insured, or where it's easy to just throw them out of the company if a company is facing economic bad times. In those kind of countries, it's more difficult, and the most vulnerable and the poorest are harder hit. But in general, in every country, this is the case, right? It's the poorest and the most vulnerable that are affected most by Corona. But if you look between countries, this is not necessarily the case. And I think, I think that some countries, some poorer or generally more vulnerable countries to climate change, are dealing better with Corona or are less affected than some of the richest countries in the world. And we're currently in the second wave in Europe. And I think the US is, I'm not sure if it's a second or a third wave that they're in. But if you look at the number of casualties, it's much higher than in many poorer parts of the world. So, and then let's look at post-Corona. I already mentioned Europe is currently in the middle of the second wave. So it's very hard to even think about, post-Corona at the moment, because all our I think our hope for a quick vaccine that would fix this issue is we're becoming more and more realistic about this vaccine and how difficult it will actually be to have a vaccine and to vaccinate entire populations. And so we're becoming more realistic about how long this crisis is actually going to last, including in many of the sectors I've mentioned before. But still, I think it's important to share some thoughts on financing for adaptation and mitigation in particular, and how it could look like in the future. So first of all, I think the focus of financing will change. We've seen through COVID-19 how deep and how interconnected risks actually are, and we've seen that resilience to risks is multifaceted, right? Countries that thought that there would be an easy fix to Corona are paying the largest price. So you can't just add intensive care capacities to address COVID-19. No, you also have to do information campaigns, enforce social distancing, limit mobility of people, etc., etc., etc. And the same accounts for adaptation to climate change and for mitigation. So, as an example, for adaptation, you can't just install, more water efficient irrigation systems. You also have to create awareness on climate change. You have to educate people on water use. You have to have long-term strategies in place. You need to have the science right about what the future will bring in terms of water shortage, etc. And then second and related, the addressing such interconnected and multifaceted risks also requires multilateralism and as well as good coordination and buy-in from all actors in society. I think that's also something we see very clearly now. So to stay within the same examples, you have to have multilateral cooperation to address adaptation to climate change on a global scale. You just have to have it, not just for financial reasons. And domestically as well, you can't expect one particular sector to deal with adaptation, even if it feels as a local thing. You have to engage the entire society, basically. And then a third point, I think it's important to focus now more on, in this context, to focus more on financing aspects. COVID-19 will definitely, or is definitely, imposing further uncertainties to, first of all, the international support for mitigation and adaptation that I've mentioned before. So the climate finance under the UNFCCC climate negotiations, and evidence to date, I think, indicates that even though ODA and climate finance have not provided the largest volume of external financing to developing countries, it's been a very stable source. And it will probably remain essential for developing countries in the medium to long term to smooth out the impact of the economic crisis and to deal with Corona as well in this context. And then second, I think the immediate responses to Corona have kind of diverged resources and capacity and attention in general from long-term adaptation investments and disaster risk reduction projects. But the magnitude of it is not yet known, as internal evaluations have not yet been concluded. And I think that the focus will move back towards more long-term adaptation, but probably COVID-19 will need to be integrated somehow. So that's the international side of it. Then the domestic one, I already mentioned these massive public investments and stimulus packages to address the economic impacts of COVID-19 and the responses to COVID-19. it's I think Kennedy and Sandra already mentioned it as well. It's massive, and it's very interesting to see how that all of a sudden is possible. But it's also something that we shouldn't take for granted now, just because it's possible, because the billions that are being invested in both healthcare and stimulus packages are done at a time when tax revenues actually decrease because economies shrink. So governments are increasing their debt, and that actually means that over time they will have less fiscal space to make additional investments in the future, for example, to address climate change. So unless climate change aspects are integrated now in these stimulus packages, it will be very difficult to address climate change, because we like to think now that we're currently in the corona crisis, and once this is done, we can address the climate crisis. But we forget. But if we reason like that, we seem to forget that actually, in order to prevent a really big climate crisis, we have to act on climate change now. We can't just move it towards, a certain time in the future when COVID has been addressed with. So we have to integrate climate change aspects in our COVID response packages now. So for that, it's already, this is not my idea, as many people share this idea, but for that there are green recovery packages, and some of them are internationally supported or not. They're key, they're central to address both climate change and COVID-19. But what green means in these packages is there's nobody checking on the quality of how green things actually are. So it's very important that it's not just something that governments flag or show off with, but it has to be sincere. And the second aspect is that so far, from what I've seen, these green recovery packages, they do include mitigation aspects, but adaptation and resilience are of secondary importance. And I think for many countries, adaptation should be prioritized more. So what does it mean, green recovery? I think there's a lot of discussion on what a good green recovery looks like and how you can use these stimulus packages now to create jobs now and to have longer term benefits in terms of climate. I think if you look at mitigation, this could, for example, be investments in renewable energy, in isolation, in energy efficiency, in bicycle infrastructure. So these are all investments that create a lot of jobs over the next months and years, but they will have long-term impacts or long-term benefits that might not necessarily be financially attractive for the private sector to finance because of the long term. And in terms of adaptation, you could think of things like afforestation or flood defense infrastructure. This might be economically not the most attractive. It might not necessarily cause big economic growth on the short term, but it will create a lot of jobs, and it will create long-term benefits. And then finally, I think looking at international finance, international private finance, commercial finance. I already mentioned this importance of sustainable finance at the beginning and of implementing Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. And I think increasingly, before the crisis already, governments started to create legislation on sustainable finance. So for example, they were creating taxonomies, which define what kind of investments fit or don't fit within the climate strategies of countries. And they were preparing disclosure legislation, which basically forces investors or makes it mandatory for investors, let's put it more nicely, to disclose climate-related risks of their investments. And this will increasingly nudge the financial sector away from brown towards more green sectors and activities, because it will demonstrate the vulnerability of some of the investments in, for example, the oil sector, And by demonstrating vulnerability, it also demonstrates the risks that such investments face if there should be, a hurricane or whatever. It's not yet clear how Corona will affect this sustainable finance. It's clear that countries are continuing to pursue the creation of legislation on this, and we've only seen the start, but the movement is growing, and it's already clear, as I mentioned before, that under Corona, sectors such as the oil sector and the aviation sector are being hit hard, losing sometimes up to 70%, 75% of their stock value, for example, making big losses, and so they're in the terrible position that they have to address the Corona crisis and the climate crisis that is coming on top of this, and so we could actually see phasing out of large parts of these sectors in a quicker or faster way than we could have imagined, because of the Corona crisis that lays on, that puts additional strains on these sectors, additional to climate change strains. Yes, to round off, it was a long story. Sorry for that. I think it's clear that post-COVID economies will be different from the pre-COVID economies. The longer the COVID crisis takes, the more likely it is that we will see significant changes. And finally, governments really have to take climate change into account in their stimulus packages. To recover from COVID-19. So I'd like to leave it there, and of course I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very well-informed presentation. I did not want to stop you at all, because that is a very pertinent topic. You're very well touched about the very different facets of financing, even pre-COVID, and going into looking at how or what we expect to see post-COVID, and of course looking at the uncertainties that how the uncertainties look like, and I know most of you, and I can already see on the chat section questions coming and comments coming on that very pertinent topic. What do we expect? How do we expect financing to look like? And you've very well broken down how climate financing has been before and what kind of issues we've had. And most African economies really depend on adaptation financing to tackle the issues that we had. Now looking at COVID, what do we really expect on that? So thank you very much, Peter, and we wish you well. Thank you for that conversation, and we look forward to coming back to that topic. So just to move forward to the next speaker, we want to now look at the context of the South Asian continent. And here we have Dr. Manish, who's been a partner in the Climate South project as well, where we've been looking at the case study of Kenya and India. So Manish is an assistant professor at the Energy Resources Institute, TERI, in New Delhi, India. And he has great interest in climate change and perspectives of justice and governance. So Manish, looking at now the South Asia region, which is a very major economic region and also very critical to addressing climate change. What are some of the emerging connections between the responses of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate action that are already visible, or that can be already be described in your region? So Manish, welcome.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, ARIN, for giving me this opportunity to think about the experiences around the COVID crisis, and in light of what we may learn for climate action. From the region's point of view, you can see that the region is quite diverse in terms of how it has dealt with, how it has been affected by the COVID crisis. Of course, the direction of economic impact is same, but the degree has been very wide. And that then opens up an interesting question that what is it that explains that divergence in the economic impacts of COVID in different countries. Now that is a huge task, so I would limit myself to the experience from India. The one overarching point that I would like to make here is an observation about the green recovery packages across the world. Many climate activists and researchers have written about, demanded that the recovery packages be green. And as Peter pointed out, that the green is really a black box to a great extent. But once the packages were announced, there have been voices of disappointment as well. For the reason that the economy has taken precedence over the green economy or embedding climate concerns into in the recovery process. And I think there is an important lesson for all of us to learn, that the transition takes time. And if you do not have inbuilt infrastructure, inbuilt governance systems, then you cannot create them overnight. And when you are faced with the challenges of immediate recovery, immediate relief, you can't really think or focus on building new ones. Of course, people have cited the Green Deal from EU as one possible example of green recovery package, but that's a long-term package. So that was going to take place with or without COVID. Yes, as again Peter said, that COVID has made many things acceptable. So that's the only contribution that we have. So we should be careful and considerate about the fact that building necessary infrastructure, public opinion, and governance systems that are required for low carbon development and climate resilient development take time. And our real challenge is that how best we could compress that time. And that time dimension should never be looked beyond or ignored. So that's the overall observation that I have. Coming back to the specific observations from the Indian experience, I have 3 points to share, and they are mostly loud thinking at this point. One, of course, relates to the economy and recovery package from the mitigation point of view. Now, if you look at one interesting statistics from India is that in the power sector, which drives or which contributes the largest share of GHG emissions, if you look at the plant load factors, then they have declined by 10% on a year-on-year basis for this period. But the decline in economy is much bigger. So the good point about that is that there is an example of decoupling of emissions and economic growth. But the other and worrisome side of it is that most of that decoupling has the poor and the marginalized and most vulnerable groups of people at the center. So the moment that growth goes down, those are the people who get more prima facie affected. A similar experience may not be as comparable in terms of vulnerable communities, but is there in EU, that yes, the emissions have come down, but it's only about 20% during lockdown. So what we have to understand is that a bulk of our emissions are embedded in the system, and that is something that has to be at the center of it. So even if the new productions or new investments are in less emission intensive options, we will still have a base and very high emission intensive base to live with, and that is really a concern and focus. And it is from that point of view, we should look at the recovery packages and whether there were opportunities, what opportunities were lost, and whether the forthcoming recovery packages, because it seems that the economies continue to be in vulnerable situations, so we would need more continued recovery packages. I think the use of public finance and public expenditure as a lever to push investments or activities towards climate sensitive activities is something that has to be at the center, that has been pointed out by activists and researchers. But there are ways to do it, and the detail is kind of missing. For example, it has been pointed out that one could use the public expenditure, public support, public income support to the vulnerable people through job creation in the forestry sector, revitalizing the forests. And that would create livelihoods, incomes, can create forest-based industries, and would be good in the long run for climate action, both mitigation as well as adaptation. Or one could use the packages to indicate which types of activities, which industries we want to prosper and which we want to slowly wither away. Now that the economies are already in, or many sectors are in a poor state, one can take hard decisions. So one could have thought about pushing electric vehicles through recovery packages, could make that more attractive. So these are the options, but unfortunately, if we see that the India's recovery package, it is not, it has lost those opportunities. And that happened because we were not really thinking, there was not a very established narrative about these detailed sectoral transitions for climate change. Our thought process has always been on technology and not the people. In our just transition, well, just transition has brought in people in some sense, but so far our conversations were very technology centric. So that's another that's an important observation to my mind, that we need to think about people more, their vulnerabilities more, even when we are thinking about mitigation and mitigation policies. There is one good and interesting development that happened, that about 24 industry leaders came together and put forth a declaration for taking their recoveries, their restarting of businesses in a more climate sensitive way. In addition, we also saw that there was a massive public support, both in terms of contributing finance to carry out help activities. So one has this kind of base or willingness to contribute available, and we need to think about how best we can mobilize, organize, as well as govern that. So these are from the mitigation point of view, 3 points. From adaptation point of view, what stood out from India's experience was the centrality of transport sector for that adaptation. we saw after the lockdown that there was a massive exodus from megacities to rural areas. And that those images were horrifying. And the solution was fairly simple, that you could arrange for transport just for people to move back to their homes. But that could not, that did not happen. And that's why we added vulnerability, and we saw the cross sectionality of vulnerability. In some states like Bihar, which is which is currently actually going through assembly elections, but which faces regular floods, and the intersectionality of flood with the inward migration or reverse migration, there was never thought of. And so what the important element here, beside the job losses, which are easy to or normally thought about, the first things that one think about when it comes to vulnerabilities, but transport as infrastructure and how important it is for resilience and adaptation was really brought to fore. Now that, to my mind, poses two interesting questions about how we think for adaptation. And now that we also have an adaptation goal under Paris Agreement, I think this question must be asked, that can we think of adaptation in a transport-less manner? So a transport-less adaptation, what if we have to think about that, what would it look like and how can we implement that? And the other is to making the transport systems resilient to these type of shocks. How can we do that? It goes without saying that the health infrastructure in any vulnerable scenarios would be the backbone of resilience. So health and transport are two important areas for infrastructure to think about. So that was the second broad set of observation. And third, to my mind, is a couple of big, broader conceptual questions. And I know we are running short of time, so I would just put them out in brief manner, and maybe if there is interest, we could take questions on that. The first observation is that so far literature is fraught with mitigation scenarios which focus on technologies. But I think it is important now, after the experience from COVID, to think about governance-centric adaptation scenarios. Our governance systems were not ready to deal with it. And there is still a lot of uncertainty in many developing countries, perhaps also in many developed countries, that if the pandemic spread continues, if there are second, third, fourth waves for say 2 or 3 more years, how are we going to really deal with it? A lot is based on that. Okay, by the moment you have vaccine, things would be fine, or we could start coming back to normal. But as in India, it has been officially announced that we do not have a vaccine delivery system to adults here, and we need to develop that. And that might take a much longer time than actually producing vaccine. And that's a question of governance. So I think governance-centric adaptation scenarios should be an important research area. Second point in here is we should rethink in developing countries, particularly about the urban-rural link in the context of migration. I think dispersed quasi-urbanization can be more useful for both resilience and mitigation. So the infrastructure building or job opportunities or the centers of growth should not be the mega cities. We should not aim for building mega cities, but should focus on building resilient third-tier cities, so that there is local resilience, local capacity to deal with crises like this. And finally, is a question of behavior, both of political class and population at large. How do we respond to scientific knowledge and information? How do our behavioral patterns reflect our ability to actually exploit or make use of available resilience mechanisms? There is a great deal to do, of need to reflect on that, to figure out what type of behavioral capacities we would need if we want to build a resilient, climate resilient world, and how can we build governance systems or incentives or awareness programs, or a combination of multiple strategies to build that behavioral asset, which cannot be damaged by the climatic events, but every climatic events would perhaps strengthen it. So a self-governing resilient system in behavioral assets. I think that is the way forward, and I would stop at that. Thank you.
Many thanks, Manish, for that very elaborate description of the South Asian experience, both pre-COVID and post-COVID. I think you've touched on very pertinent issue. First one on governance and how looking at the various vulnerabilities, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, and very importantly, how can we mobilize the public to support climate action and economic recovery. And of course, your last point on the behavioral change, how do we respond to scientific knowledge and information? Those are the very, very important issues that I think in the African continent, we can have a look at and see what we could borrow from that experience of South Asia. Thank you very much, Manish. So thank you. I think we've finished with all the panelists. We've heard from all four of them, very interesting perspectives coming in, and very interesting questions also flowing on the chat box. But before we go and look at the questions, I want to invite my very good friend, Professor Ed Brown, who is a professor, the director of the Modern Energy Cooking Services Program, based at the Loughborough University, and also is professor of Global Energy Challenges, and is also the coordinator of the Low Carbon Energy Development Network based in the UK, and has been very well networked with both African and South Asia countries. So Professor Ed, you have a very easy task of summarizing a very interesting discussion. I'm calling it report. But we could give just a very brief synthesis of all those perspectives you had, both from the global context, from the South African context, South Asia, and also looking at the green financing context. What can we really learn from that if we want to see a low carbon development and resilient economy moving forward? Professor Edgar, terrible.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for the task of trying to bring together what was a fantastic range of issues. I started actually trying to note down some themes that cut across, but I think probably the most effective thing I can do is just do a few responses to each of the speakers in turn, and raise some experiences and also potentially some questions. I thought Sander's presentation was fascinating in terms of thinking through what are the implications for all of the, I suppose, causes, in a sense, that we have all been working on and contributing towards through our research and activism for, in some cases, many decades. What exactly does COVID represent in terms of what type of a crisis is it? And I've really been thinking about it in these kinds of terms. So I'm very grateful to Sander for raising a series of issues around that. And I think one of the things that struck me was this question of the degree to which the crisis provides an opportunity, and the degree to which the crisis is causing a load of distractions and difficulties with movements in that direction. So I think that thinking through what's happening in the UK at the moment is, on one level, there is a recognition that there potentially is an opportunity to think this through in different ways, in the way that Sander was suggesting, but at the same time, there are very much entrenched forces that are stopping that from occurring. So I think one of the ways we've perhaps not talked about it in the discussion thus far is what's the political economy of whether or not the response to the crisis will move in the kind of directions that we want it to go in. So I think that's one issue that would be really interesting to think about. I think the second thing is Sander talked about this idea of managed change, and I think drew on a couple of examples, one of which was the example of the UK coal industry. And again, I think political economy comes an important component of that, since on one level, from the perspective of producing a change in the direction that the economy and the country was going in relation to the sources of energy upon which it's relied, then you could argue that the UK government's change and move away from coal is something very beneficial. Clearly it is from the climate agenda. However, if we think back to the 1980s and everything that occurred during that period, then communities that were devoted to coal production were not supported effectively through that process. And many of the divides between the haves and the have-nots in the UK still relate to the legacy of that period, when many societies, many communities had the heart torn out of them. So I think that's really interesting in terms of what do we provide in terms of support to communities that are worst affected by these kinds of period of crisis and period of change that we may go through. So I think that's an interesting question on where are the bases of different movements for change. So I think that there were, I hadn't really been thinking about these issues from those political perspectives before. So I'm very grateful to an opportunity to start thinking through those issues. Nachi's presentation was also really thoughtful. I think that, as you know, Victoria, we, in terms of Loughborough and Acts together, have been very conscious of the role of local government, often as a missing part of the agenda, particularly in our case when we've been working together in relation to energy, that often the county is the place where policies are really put into action, and yet the level of institutional quality, the level of preparation, but also the level of funding, even though it's meant to go down to the county level, in terms of what is actually there in terms of implementing policy, is perhaps relatively limited. So I think that focus on the role of local government is really important. As you know, we're collaborating on a project in Kenya together for the ministry around the quality of planning at national and at county level. And I think that's really important, going on to thinking about Manish's presentation about the quality of institutions. Then I think that's something we can come back to, particularly where there are the opportunities to think about, is our city governments and county governments more effective at bringing together those working on a range of different issues, water, health, climate, to think in a more joined up way about COVID responses and COVID strategic responses. So I think that's a really interesting area. And what can we do to make decentralized delivery more prominent, more effectively funded in terms of the responses to COVID and in terms of the responses to the climate crisis. Peter's presentation, I could talk for hours in terms of all of the issues that Peter raised there, and unfortunately we don't have all of that time. I think clearly the point that he raises about the fact that public finance for climate is already, whilst still being maintained, beginning to be dwarfed in terms of other areas of finance is really important. Whether that might be affected by the responses to COVID in terms of a diversion of funding away from the climate agenda towards other agendas, I think is something we should be considerate of. I think, again, just thinking about the UK, we have a possibility in terms of those of us that are involved in these debates within the UK of taking advantage of the UK's chairing of the COP and the imminent preparation. We're liaising quite a bit with the UK government on that at the moment about what can we as the UK do to promote resolution to many of the outstanding issues that there still are in relation to COP and to the Paris Agreement. And I think that's how is COVID affecting that? I think certainly what we're seeing at the moment is that the UK government is still committed to taking forward many of the agendas under Paris. And what that means in terms of how that is impacted by COVID. And in some ways you can see a push that actually it becomes even more important that the opportunities for green growth are seen as one of the areas which can be bringing together of the economic and the climate elements to it. So I think all of that I think is very interesting on that perspective. At the same time, however, we can also see the more traditional international development assistance budgets being questioned and challenged. So at the same time, while there is significant resourcing going into preparations for COP, we as the managers of various FCDO, previously DFID supported programs, have seen cuts to those programs initiated this year because of the cuts in GDP. So we've had to find cuts for this financial year in some of the programs that we're operating. Longer term, I think it's going to actually open up more possibilities, but certainly in the short term, that's really important. And that I think raises some issues in the final presentation from Manish around to what degree can we really realistically talk about a pre and post COVID world? So the idea of the importance of what period of time are we actually talking about going through this process within? Because from what I can see of what the discussions are in the UK, even if there is a vaccine ready to go in March or April time, then it's likely that that's a vaccination which will have to be repeated every year. So for example, we have flu every year in the UK, and every year more vulnerable groups are given a vaccine that only has a kind of 60% success rate and has to be reproduced every year. So it's, and the flu is very, very similar in its nature to COVID. So in that sense, there, I think in some ways is an over-optimistic take on what a vaccine can achieve and therefore how quickly we can move into a so-called post-COVID world. The second point from Manish's presentation that I absolutely agree with, and it takes us back to where I started from, is the need for governance focus in a lot of what is emerging at the moment. I'm still thinking through a lot of the issues that came up in that discussion, and these four presentations were really quite different in their orientation. But I think that focus on governance, I think, is one thing that brings things together. So yeah, I'm not sure what I've added in terms of trying to think through all of these connections, but yeah, some really interesting themes to begin tackling here, I think, and I'm looking forward to the questions and answers and discussion with the panel members. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was very brilliant. I don't think I could have done any better from that very rich discussion that has just happened from the very 4 different contexts that we listened to. That I will not add any much to that because of time. But at this point, I just want to hand over to my colleague Kennedy to just take us through some of the questions that are coming in from the discussion. So Kennedy, kindly, if you may take us through that as we aim to catch up with time.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I think the discussion has been really good and very rich that we've even we didn't realize time has just flown by. But I think it's really good having, that very nice broad range of discussions, but also having Professor Ed Brown synthesizing, the discussions in a very nice way and distilling the key points. I think it's very interesting. Some of the key points that have been sort of emerging are also reflected in the questions that we have. So I think in the interest of trying to make the best use of the little time that we have remaining, I think each of our panelists will be allocated a question to answer. I think that will make it quite effective. So we start with Nachi. I think we'll just read the first round of questions and direct each to each of the panelists, and then you'll have like 2 minutes or so to respond to the question. So I think the first question will go to Nachi, which is why is it that smallholder farmers, especially in Africa, who are hardest hit by climate change and COVID-19, feel that they're not part of the policy-making process? This in turn leads to low participation in implementation of climate change activities. The farmers also feel the incentives provided are not enough, and to make them fully support carbon finance projects. And I think this question, Nachi, can be broadened to also cover the mitigation aspect. And maybe as you're answering that question, you can also share some of the reflections you've had in dealing with sub-national actors, and especially trying to engage those groups who are usually left out in the policy-making process. The second question will go to Sanda, and the question is, COVID-19 has affected economies, causing huge losses of income. Therefore, will not COVID-19 affect the mobilization of resources in countries, including African countries, especially in the implementation of NDCs and the achievement of objectives, climate objectives as they revive the economy? So maybe, Sanda, you can reflect a little bit more on how, some of the actors are framing and drawing the connections between the economic and the climate change aspect with some of the work that you've been doing with your working group. I think the third question goes to Peter. And so the comment is, the poor and most vulnerable in society are hard hit by COVID-19. What is the scale in terms of their adaptive capacity? Does it mean that we've lost significant gains, especially on community-based adaptation and other adaptation measures? And what does it mean for developing countries, especially as they are updating their NDCs in terms of the adaptation components? So Peter, maybe you reflect on that and draw the connection. Manish will have the next question, which is the green post-COVID-19 recovery feasible for developing countries, particularly LDCs, where a majority of them rely on fossil fuel industries? So I think, Manish, maybe you can, as you answer that question, you'll reflect a little bit on some of the challenges that some of the developing countries have in trying to reconcile climate change and climate and green economic recovery. So I think the last one would go to Professor Ed Brown. And there's a comment which says, and the question says, what an interesting comment that you made earlier on. It seems that equating COVID-19 to flu and the vaccines, we might stop addressing the future as post-COVID-19 and perhaps call it an alternative future. Where will we need to live with COVID-19? So I think, Professor Ed Brown, as you answer that, you can reflect on the meaning of crisis and whether COVID-19 might be a critical juncture, or maybe we'll just revert back to pre-COVID. So I think the panelists can have a go at the first round of questions.
Thank you very much, Kennedy, for that question, and to the participants. So I think in terms of the reference to smallholders in particular, I would say we could even broaden it, as you say. So it's not about necessarily smallholders alone, but it's just one example of many other stakeholders that are often left out in decision-making processes. The same applies with, say, for example, women not being represented in decision-making processes, or people that live in informal settlements, whereby you find interventions or projects are decided on their behalf and they're left behind in the decision-making process. And it is important to ensure that there is strengthened public participation, and beyond that, for improved engagements in general, be it with the private sector, be it ensuring that there is gender equality, as well as just general inclusion of marginalized groups. So I think it's a cross-cutting issue amongst stakeholders that are often outside of the decision-making processes, where things often happen in boardrooms, so to say, where it would mainly be councils or people that are more influential that are seen to be able to make decisions. So, and then you have other people being neglected or left out in the decision-making processes. And also, just slightly differently, but to add on to this, is that particularly when it comes to subnational governments, there has been progress in terms of decentralizing or devolving certain functions. But as much as that is happening, it's happening at a very slow rate, and it's not necessarily matched with subnational governments' ability to be able to respond to it, particularly when it comes to the energy sector, where we are seeing new pathways for energy access in particular, and opportunities are starting to open up. But due to lack of capacity for, amongst others, energy data collection and planning and access to finance, then there are lost opportunities when it comes to being able to deliver better services. So certainly improved public-private partnerships is important. Involvement of different stakeholders, be it smallholder farmers, be it women or other marginalized groups, is absolutely critical if we really are to have cities that are inclusive, are resilient, and livable and safe, and for people to have access to economic opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nachi, for the very brief answer. So I think we just go around the way we read the questions. Next, our panelists can take up the question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's me. So your question is about whether and how COVID-19 affects kind of the resources for implementing NDCs. And I want to say here that I'm not sure every time we talk about implementing NDCs, whether implementing is the right word, in the sense that whether or not we meet the Paris goals really depends on kind of underlying changes. And NDCs are formulated in a politically strategic way, where some governments might be kind of putting out lower targets because they know that there's a cycle that they're expected to put on the table higher ambitions over time. So politically, it might be that some governments are kind of, holding back on their official ambitions. I think there's a couple of ways to approach this question. Like, I think if you think of it financially, Peter already mentioned how the focus on COVID-19 now, within the mindset of tackling the climate crisis afterwards, doesn't hold up. So it is true for the private sector and for the public sector that COVID-19 might divert climate priorities, divert from climate priorities. At the same point, and I really appreciate Professor Ed Brown's comment on this, that I think the real questions are the shifts in the underlying political economy. One thing that is very interesting, I find recently throughout the crisis, is that if you look at quote unquote the real economy, you see a lot of the commitments coming from non-state and subnational actors haven't become less. In fact, it has accelerated quite a bit. At the moment, there's this huge movement for net zero commitments among private sector actors. A lot of businesses have signed up to join a race to net zero. And you see that also with governments. I think the most positive news in a long time on climate is China's carbon neutrality goal and Japan's climate neutrality by 2050 goal. So it's interesting that we do see a lot of these commitments, both at the governmental level, at the subnational level, and at the non-state level, at the height of this crisis. So there seems to be this might indicate a change, but commitments are easily made, I have to say, and we have seen in the past that commitments are not always followed up on. So this is a strong case for tracking those actions and making sure that they are credible. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sander. I think for that very nice, concise response. I think next we go to Peter.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for a good question. So the question was, you know, that I mentioned that the poor and the most vulnerable are hit the hardest by Corona, or actually by the measures taken against the Corona crisis. I think Manish mentioned this mass migration in India of people trying to get back from the cities to the rural areas where their families have origin. And then the question was, do people, you know, have we lost the adaptation gains that we made over the last 5, 10, 20 years? I find it a very, very difficult question to answer, but I think as I mentioned earlier, I think it becomes more clear because of COVID how multifaceted risks are. So you know, we've seen that good governance helps people to or helps countries in the fight against COVID-19. Education, inclusion of the marginalized groups, gender aspects, all these things, some of them were mentioned earlier today. I think addressing general inequality in countries, right? Countries that are more unequal seem to be, I mean, I haven't seen a study on it, I haven't done research on it, but it just seems that if you look at Western countries, for example, those that are more unequal, like the UK and the US, seem to be affected more by COVID-19. And so to go back to the question, have people lost the gains in adaptation? I think if not necessarily from you know, if you look at the explicit adaptation aspects per se, right? The dams are still there, the flood barriers are still there, the water inefficient irrigation systems are still functioning, so that all remains. But I think for many people in the world, if the fundaments under your existence, on which you base your existence, which is an income, for example, if that is smashed away by either Corona or the response measures to Corona, then yes, we have lost a lot in terms of how resilient people are. So it's a difficult question to answer, but I think in any case we gained this idea of, or we gained a knowledge in terms of understanding how multifaceted risks are, and also to, I think, to think beyond, you know, if we look at it, to think beyond, you know, the flood that might happen next year, but also to look beyond it and think like, okay, the short-term impacts of a flood might be that my land is flooded, but what are the long-term impacts, and how do you prevent also long-term impacts through the things I mentioned, inclusion of marginalized groups, gender aspects, good governance, education, etc. I think these fundamental things are increasingly in the spotlight now, also because of what we experienced with the COVID-19 crisis.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for that very concise response. I think next we go to Manish.
Thanks, Ken. Well, this is obvious question, the feasibility of green recovery. I think we, in a pragmatic manner, we could unbundle the term green here in terms of what it means for different groups of countries. I would be inclined to argue that for least developed countries, whose total emissions are very low at the global scale, for them it should actually mean resilience and adaptation. Green does not or should not necessarily respond to or be referred to mean mitigation only. Resilience should also become a synonym for green, or maybe other way around. So for least developed countries, I think that is how I would say look at the green post COVID recovery, that they identify how well they could rework their governance structures to build a more resilience, and also to the extent possible they could move towards clean industries. Of course, that would be a long-term program. But for other larger developing countries, I think it is possible, provided that they think it in terms of the classic macroeconomic question of full employment and appropriate utilization of the traditional means of production, capital and labor. How do they deploy those resources to achieve that objective of full employment? This was the example when I was discussing about the using the public expenditure to create jobs in forestry sector. That is one such example where you could bring these elements of green recoveries, where you create livelihoods matters. That is, in my view, the sole most important shift in political economy of development that needs to take place. So it is possible, provided we pick on and strengthen the undercurrent of political economic signals that come out of the COVID-19 experience. The one positive development you can take the announcement by South Africa that they despite the very strong coal lobby, they have in this period been able to manage the conflicting interest and announce a just transition as the nationwide target. I think that gives a hope that it is possible. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Manish. And I think as we are running almost to the top of the hour, I think we'll have Professor Ed Brown taking the next question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the response to my kind of almost a throwaway comment there about what we're thinking around in terms of where we're going in relation to COVID. And the question that Atela asked me was should we perhaps call it an alternative future where we all need to just live with COVID-19? it's a very hot topic of debate in the UK at the moment, as we seem to be heading into a second period of lockdown. Now, something like already a fifth of the country are locked down again, after having had an extended period of time when we were locked down earlier on in the year. And at the moment, it's precisely this question is up for discussion within the UK. But I think it's kind of, there are two elements to this discussion. Number one is, when we talk about just living with COVID, then does that mean actually being just getting on with life now, in terms of not locking down, not putting restrictions on people and so on, and letting the number of people with the illness build up, and therefore building up immunity in the population? You maybe heard this term herd immunity that people have talked a lot about. I'll come back to that in a second. Or the other is recognizing that we will have to have measures designed to limit the impact and implications of COVID in place for the foreseeable future, however long that might be, either because it's always going to be around because there will not be a way of actually building up levels of immunity so that it no longer has an impact, or is there a longer term way in which we can actually build up the levels of immunity so it becomes more possible to control living with it? I think the problem with the first of those, in terms of not taking action now to deal with the current implications of COVID, is firstly, that has very different impacts on different groups of people. And secondly, it affects the resilience of our institutional systems and governance systems, and indeed even just keeping our economies running, if you have a significant number of people in hospital at the same time. So certainly my perspective on this is certainly not to argue that we should be just letting it wreak havoc in our populations. We have to control it. But then what are the implications of that if we're saying we have to control it, but yet we're also recognizing that we're not only controlling it until a vaccine comes along and then everything will be solved? What does that mean for the longer term resilience of our strategies for dealing with COVID, and by implication on our longer term strategies for the nature of our economies, how they function and so on? So if living with it means recognizing that it will have a significant long-term impact on growth within our economies and on the levels of demand, then unless we instigate some of the ways of building an economy that is less focused on growth, then I think we're in for a very, very difficult future, in the sense that it's going to intensify not only differences within economies, but differences globally. So in that sense, at the moment, you could almost argue that COVID is affecting northern economies and northern societies in simple, bald health terms. It would appear more significantly. But in the longer term, if demand remains constrained without a change in the way in which economies interact, then that is going to affect a lot of countries across the developing world very, very significantly, even if they're not currently affected in terms of their economies in that way. So I think there's some significant issues around that. However, what we've been looking at today is there may be real opportunities to look at things in a slightly different way. One of the things we've been working on MEX is, could this give us an opportunity to finally bring to the political questions of dealing with women's health, dealing with the fact that nothing or very little is being done about exposure to air pollution within our houses? Is this an opportunity to recognize that that actually affects people's resilience to the implications of COVID in the longer term and their long-term health? What about questions around ability to work from home? If we're recognizing that mobility issues mean that, should we be looking not at the building of megacities, as Manish was suggesting, but actually how do we instill a more effective balance between the rural and the urban, and between third tier and second tier cities and so on? So it's maybe not, it's thinking about what are the opportunities to build something different, because we are now having to live with COVID potentially over a long period of time, rather than thinking about it as a pre-COVID and post-COVID, and just thinking it as a one-off epidemic that everything will then return to normal on afterwards. So that's just a few reflections on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ed Brown. And I think we've gotten to the top of the hour, so I think I'll just beg you all just a few more minutes as we conclude. So we have a very interesting model at ARIN where we have regional focal points across the continent. Everyone knows Africa is a very big place, but we have our regional focal points who help to contextualize some of these things. So as we conclude in the next few minutes, which I hope you'll bear with us, I'll ask each of the regional focal points in 1 minute or less. I've been listening to the conversation. We've had very stimulating discussions. What is that one thing that we've missed in 1 minute or less? So we'll have Kezia speaking and then telling us what we missed on urban development since it's very high urbanization and COVID-19. Professor Kalaba will tell us what we missed on the connection between adaptation and development. Antoine will tell us what did we miss as regards to participation of the most important people or people who are most affected by COVID-19 and climate change. And Albert Ahin will finish up with reflecting on governance. So please, 1 minute or less, tell us what you missed, but we'll go in that order. Kezia, please. Kezia, so I think Kezia, I think we're missing Kezia. So Professor Kalaba? No. Antoine?
Well, I'm still here.
Yes. What did we miss on participation of the most vulnerable people?
It's always a pleasure being with you. You hear me? Hello?
Yes, very clearly.
It's always a pleasure being with ARIN in this kind of events, and a lot of things have been said, and I have to congratulate all the panelists. They have been very uppoint. The only thing is, as you know, public policies are not really easy because they affect people into their interests, and sometimes government tend to showing that they know more than anyone what is good for their constituent, and usually constituents are not involved at the elaboration, at the conception of those policies, and whenever you want to apply it to them, there is always a problem. It has been the example with the COVID-19. I think government in Africa try to have the same answer, the same response than developed country, where you have a very well organized, probably economic sector, where in Africa, 80% of most economy are informal. Like people wake up in the morning and they go to look for what they will have to use for the day. So if you just because you are faced with the pandemic, you have this kind of very restriction, and you want to close out everything, you're not having the good result that you're waiting for, and this is what happened in most of our country. So I don't know, and I say it's gonna be another pandemic. So next time, I think what these people will have to do is try to involve the public on the decision making. Ask people what is the best thing to do, what they think that is going to be helpful, and not just decorating and trying to apply it to them. I think that's what's missing. In terms of
thank you, Antoine.
In terms of climate action and sustainable energy, what I want to say is this is not the first time that the world is faced with energy transition. It's happened twice or more. So it's not when it's going to happen again, but how we have to follow up on things. The mistake is to like making a divide between developed country and developing country. We don't have, I don't think in our country we have the luxury to be following the development path of what we call actually developed country. So we will have to make some diet choice and use the energy that is available to us, of course, but the most green possible and the most the less emitting possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoine, for that very concise set of remarks. And thank you also for being quite an active regional focal point and also trying to get the Francophone part of Africa as well engaged. Thank you so much. So unless we have Albert is in, then I'll just hand it over to Dr. Joanes Atela to synthesize the comments in a few minutes and then just wrap it up. Over to you, Dr. Joanes Atela.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Kennedy. Are you able to hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay. So thank you so much, Kennedy and Victoria and the panelists for a very interesting engagement that we've had. I think there were so many perspectives that were coming in, some of which I was actually getting amazed at the level of information that is existing out there and that we need to put our hands into. I know time has gone and we are almost about 10 minutes over time. So I'm not going to take I'm basically going to take about 5 minutes just to conclude this because I suspect my role is basically to say thank you to everybody who has been part of this. But before I do that, allow me just to mention a few points, just to reflect on some of the perspectives that have been raised in this discussion. Number one, I think it is very clear that the intersection between COVID-19 and climate action is a very complex situation, and especially thinking of it in the context of Africa, where climate change has been reported to be, the impacts of climate change have been reported to be a bit severe. And listening to the discussions, I think there's a level of uncertainty and what I would also call unclarity in terms of what is the connection between the COVID-19 and climate issues and climate action. I think some of the things that have been discussed are really very useful in terms of how COVID really intersects not only across different aspects. COVID intersects the processes of climate action. We've heard about how COVID intersects on the policy aspects of climate action and of course the planning aspects as well, which have been brought up in a very strategic way across the panelists. Of course, globally, we've seen even the COP actually being postponed because of COVID. And of course, if we postpone the COP, that would mean that a lot of the policy, the global policy momentum is in one way or the other affected. Because at the COP, I think that is where a lot of momentum is built. But also in terms of resources, I think there's a lot of perspective in terms of concerns around redirecting resources, basically to be able to combat the impacts of the COVID-19. And thinking about this in the context of the NDCs, because a lot of the African countries, if you look at most of the NDCs that African countries have prepared, you will realize that a lot of these are conditional NDCs. And when I say conditional NDCs, they're NDCs that are to be implemented subject to availability of international funding. So the situation with the COVID would then mean that if that international funding would not be available, then the implementation of NDCs would be significantly affected. But also we've heard about the national issues around really redirecting attention from the implementation of the climate actions that countries have committed to basically trying to address the economic downturn that most countries have experienced, given the element that there are a lot of economic damages that the COVID has caused. So most African countries are trying to really catch up with that economic perspective. And what that means in terms of redirecting resources and even weakening some of the innovative financial instruments that these countries were already putting in place, I think is something that is worth reflecting on. Even at the local level, I think some of the panelists have brought some very interesting perspectives around the potential vulnerabilities that basically the COVID has imposed, and basically seeing that the COVID has kind of reinforced some of the existing vulnerabilities. We know that the local African context has basically suffered a lot of climate impacts. And with the COVID-19, those particular vulnerabilities that we have been seeing, that have been reported in many places, have basically been reinforced through the COVID experience. But again, trying to understand that and trying to see, even as we look at the recoveries which countries are trying to put in place in terms of the economic rebuilding, there have been questions around, to what extent are all these rebuilding plans taking into account some of these vulnerabilities and being more inclusive to be able to address some of these concerns in a way that the rebuilding becomes really a sort of strategic and climate kind of friendly. So those are questions which have been asked, and I think most of the speakers have really brought them up in very strategic ways. But one last thing that I think has also come up is the element of opportunities that the COVID has brought. I think we all agree that the COVID situation has had a lot of impacts, but there's also a lot of opportunities that have come with it. I mean, opportunities such as the space to start thinking about risks and building preparedness and trying to make our societies more prepared, both to the known and the unknown risks such as the COVID. So those are some of the things that I've seen coming up in the discussion. So as we move forward, I think the big question is that how do we bridge the gap between some of those impacts, negative impacts that have been reported to be associated with COVID, and some of the opportunities that we are seeing as emerging, the opportunities like the economic stimulus packages. How do we make those kinds of massive, really massive packages to be climate proof? Not only climate proof in terms of addressing a mitigation, but also in terms of addressing adaptation in a way that sort of attends to the needs of the poor and the vulnerable. And I think those are the questions that we still need to respond to moving forward. And to do that, I think we'll continue to require, or we'll still need to have these kinds of discussions in order to try and unlock some of the concerns so that we can collectively come up with what I would call the collective action agenda, and to be able to inform some of these processes. I mean, it's a bit saddening that we are saying that we have these stimulus packages, but we are also concerned that the issues around climate resilience could be left out. So the question is, how can that happen? That we are having all these packages, but the climate opportunities are not being taken up. I think as the climate champions, both within the continent and outside the continent, I think we need to try and see which kind of spaces can we utilize to be able to really inform these kinds of, the process moving forward. And I think with those very few remarks, Kennedy, allow me just to, as I close, allow me to just say thank a few people who have actually been very instrumental in this particular process. First of all, allow me to thank the panelists. As I've said, the panelists have given really very strategic perspectives, which are really useful in terms of moving some of the ideas forward. Also, allow me to thank you, Kennedy and Victoria. I think you've done a fantastic moderation, and that was really useful. The ARIN Conference Committee in here, as we organize these seminars and we organize the conference as well, we have a conference committee led by Dr. Kezia. Kezia is not here, and Tom Randa, who could be here as well. Allow me to thank this committee, which has done so well in terms of organizing at least the last three, this is the third one, the last two seminars and this third one, which then are going to lead to the conference. Their guidance and strategic input into the process has been really very useful. And most importantly, allow me to thank all the participants. I think we've gone over time, but I think your patience and participation in terms of the concerns and the issues that you raised have been very useful in this particular process. So thank you very much, and may God bless you. Back to you, Kennedy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joanes Atela. And I think in closing and in conclusion, we also thank everyone for your time. Thank you for your patience as we have concluded this discussion. And please follow us on Twitter. We have a very active handle that is ARIN_Africa, and also on Facebook. Also, please check our website for more information on the upcoming conference. So thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone, and bye.
Thank you. And
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.